All right, hi everyone. Thanks for coming to the inaugural Web Native File System community call. We have a short agenda today, but like all of these kickoff calls, we'll kind of see where the conversation takes us at first, and that'll kind of inform future discussions. Boris had put together this initial. Actually, here, let me drop this in the chat. So that's, oh, and Philip at the same time. So that's what we have written down. We can also talk about literally anything. So off the top, if anybody wants to add anything that needs to go like formally on the agenda, this would be a great time. I'm personally really excited to figure out what exactly an ADL is, because I've heard like 6 different things. So, but before that, does anybody have anything that they'd like to add to this list?
I think I could add some spec updates, like where I'm at, what I'm writing right now, these kind of things.
Awesome.
I think it'd be nice to talk about whether we can standardize file systems in general outside of WNFS as well. So if interoperability between different implementations is something this group is interested in.
Do we just add those things to the discussion thing, or edit them out in like live? Okay.
For those who have edit capability. I'm also taking some notes off to the side as well. Actually, before we get in too deep here, would anybody like to scribe for today? Like, we'll obviously have the video, but it would be nice to have some notes as well.
I'll scribe.
Thank you. Awesome. Great. So we can definitely talk about those. Anything else? All right. Well, let's jump into it then. And just kind of roughly top to bottom as we go here. So Boris, you had put down review all information channels, which sounds like a very Boris topic. What are our information channels?
So basically, the general pattern that we're following with a lot of these things is we create a separate, our goal is to work on specs. And that's the starting point. So our pattern has been that we set up a working group org. Anyone is welcome to join that org, which means that you can get edit and pull and everything else like that. So we don't have to manage that on a per repo basis. Discussions as kind of the main long form space for those sorts of things. And then for chat, this is very much IPFS centric. So we've ended up getting channels created in the IPFS Discord chat. Mauve, I'm not sure if that has ended up getting bridged yet, but we can. Okay, so I'll take that as an action item. I know that the IPFS team has bridging set up, and it can be bridged to Matrix. What I don't actually know much about the PLN Filecoin Matrix. Do you know what the root of that is, Mauve?
Well, there's the roots Matrix server, which is just ipfs.io on Matrix. However,
on Matrix.
I usually just bug Discordian about it because they seem to be on top of it. Things.
Okay. Yeah, and I think so. We'll get that done. I know the team at Fission, James is going to look at some more bridging as well. And I know talking to Brendan from N0, they also have a WNFS channel in theirs, and may want some bridging and figure out some bots and some other things like that. So I think bots is outstanding. So it's often useful to have a bots channel where then we can easily see discussion and spec updates. So I will talk to Discordian and James about that. I think that's it for channels for right now. Maybe I'll actually, HackMD might be another thing that we add, but we haven't really done in the past, and we don't necessarily want to check-in notes to the specs repo. I don't think that makes a lot of sense. So let's just see what it looks like if we paste in comments in the thread and see where it goes. We do have, I think the one final place of all the places is I'm going to look at tracking the WNFS tag in the IPFS discourse forum as a likely spot to also do kind of long form of various kinds. Any other thoughts on comms channels, complaints, concerns, other than the usual information overload? Awesome. That's it for that.
Great. Awesome. Actually, we probably should have done these in the opposite order now that I'm looking at this list. Introductions. Probably helpful for us to just go around and see who everybody is, what they're interested in, what project they're working on. This is about 50% vision people, so you're going to hear a lot about vision, I think. But I guess I'll start off. So I'm Brooke. I'm the CTO at Vision. Had done the initial spec work for web native sort of broadly, and Philip has been filling in with the specs more recently as well, and hopefully we'll be getting to like actual proper formalized specs in the next couple of weeks, because it's been mainly our internal team working on stuff, and the specs have been us sharing working notes on here's how it should work. Anyhow, that's for me. I guess I'll pass it off to Boris.
Co-founder of Vision, general community wrangler on all sorts of things. Excited to kind of just follow the pattern of having more things graduate from being Vision only to community working group. And still really energized after our IPFS thing and having more people working on this stuff.
Hi, I'm Philip. I also work at Vision. I looked at the first version of WNFS that we implemented a lot and learned from that, and collaborated with Brooke on like where to go from there. And nowadays, I spend my time collaborating with AppCypher on the RS WNFS implementation. So that's the Rust implementation of WNFS that compiles to WASM, and integrating that into our web native SDK, as well as writing up the things as a spec.
Move.
Yeah, hi, my name is Move. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm here on behalf of the IPLD team, but I kind of do a lot of peer-to-peer stuff in general, especially to do with the web. So I'm really interested in WNFS in the context of it being a file system that's not UnixFS with DAGPB. And I'm really curious to see where the similarities are. I also really want to use it personally. And I'm interested in how we can have interoperability between different file systems by using IPLD specs to make it kind of like easier to gloss over. So that's the main thing I'm here for.
Brian?
Hi, I'm also from Vision. I'm a protocol engineer, and I work on our web native library where we use WinFS.
Nick?
Hello. So my name is Nick. I'm working on an app that's basically like Instagram, but using a decentralized backend. And so that's where Vision kind of comes into play. Originally, I was doing it just with the web crypto and keys that you've built some libraries around. But then I realized that WinFS provides a lot of useful things for that also. Okay. Guess that's a good enough intro for me.
Thanks, Nick. James?
Hi, James, also from Vision, VP engineering, so mostly making sure people have what they need to build WinFS and WinFS related things. Ta-da.
Joshua?
Thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm an independent dev, and I guess my day job right now is an automation engineer as of recently. And I'm interested in using WNFS and Fission's whole auth system to help strap on a live multiplayer feature to the TiddlyWiki package, which is kind of a decentralized own your own data wiki system that can be run as a Node.js server or as a standalone HTML file. So I want to make them all talk to each other.
Amazing. Thank you. And Fabrice, both introduce yourself, and then we can, I guess, just roll directly into the next item, which is Capilloon use cases and requirements.
Okay. Yeah, so Fabrice, I'm a long-time web geek, been working on Firefox and Firefox OS for a while. And so now I'm doing this Capilloon project, which is a mobile web OS where we explore how we can leverage decentralized web technologies to do something that is really different from incumbent mobile OSs. And one need is obviously to manage user data and figure out how you can persist that and so on. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if I need to get into more details right now, but we have a kind of a VFS, which is not really a VFS, but looks like it could be persisted as a VFS, and I was looking at the solution for that, and WNFS looks like a very good candidate. So yeah, that's why I'm very interested in that work.
Awesome. Yeah, I think it would be great. Maybe it's even just useful. So here's the direct link to the thread that Fabrice has started. I'll drop that in there. I think it actually might be useful if you don't mind. I can just read it out, and sure. Then you can maybe then go through what you had thought, how you're feeling about it. I had kind of a blink reaction in the thread there, but it's not very technical from my point of view. So in Capilloon, we use a virtual file system to store user data in a broad sense. It can be usual objects like pictures, downloaded documents, etc., but also other OS objects like contacts, navigation history, entry, and media playback sessions. These are organized as a hierarchy, but leafs are not plain files. They are resources that make you represented by different variants. For instance, an image will have a default variant with a full-size version, but also a thumbnail variant and an EXIF metadata variant if applicable. Media playback sessions store the page URL, title, and track info in the default variant, but also a poster image for the video as a variant, etc. Resources also have custom metadata. We maintain a visit score state that helps with surfacing the most relevant results in search queries, similar to what Firefox uses in the awesome bar. We want to persist these resources in WNFS, so we need some solution to map resources with variants to the more simple model of WNFS. I can think of a couple of options, and I'll just read the 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we can go through some of these. Turn each resource into a directory named, for example, resource name.capilloon, and store variants in that directory. 2, store the default variant as a regular file and only the non-default ones in a subdirectory. 3, use my multipart to store all variants in a single file. 4, teach WNFS that files could be more than just a UnixFS file. Really, really great background and description. I will say that things like multiple sizes of images is definitely one of the things that I've had on my internal roadmap that would be really, really like, it's an extremely useful thing. And especially if we think about IPFS, where you've got a quote unquote original image that you then derive thumbnails or crops or other things from internet wide, that ends up being a really, really interesting thing. So, you know, that's one for sure that I'm +1 on like, oh, that's very interesting. So Fabrice, maybe you can give some more color. Like, are you leaning in any one of these directions right now? What would be your, of those 4?
So it's, I mean, the ideal one would probably be the fourth one, where WNFS has enough flexibility to let me define some kind of custom format for whatever is a leaf node, and maybe also for some of the metadata. But yeah, so I don't know if the work you're doing and at the spec and in the implementation side goes this way. I would say the other thing is that, yeah, I have some goals in terms of timeline of implementation that may mean that I may go through some maybe solution one initially, because that's what can be done just right now, even if we know that in the future we would switch to something else, because we are still very much building things, and that we can learn as we build. So it's really just to trigger a discussion, make sure that this kind of use cases is on the roadmap or on the radar, or discuss. Maybe it's absolutely not something you want to do, and that can be fine. I just want to know where things stand. There are also, I mean, I have some opinions about whether file systems are the right abstraction in general for end user apps. And because I said it's a virtual file system. Actually, it's more, I mean, internally, I don't even call that file system. I call that a content store. It's more like a document database with bells and whistles. And I don't think that a file system is something that users should be exposed to in any way. It's just, it's like from the 70s, guys. And we are past that. And that's why on top of the content store, I build a full text index. I build this scoring system and so on, because you can do much more with your data than just storing that in a hierarchy. And some about that. So there's this hierarchical organization, which is very classic. We also have tags that we can add to the metadata, and some file systems support that as extended attributes and so on. But what's interesting is how does tags and hierarchical organization fit together, and how you, like when you want to share stuff. I know that I organize my photos with mostly a hierarchy by date, like year, months, and probably day. But when I want to share stuff, what I usually do is that I create tags for that are kind of like, each tag is kind of an album or a subset of an album that I want to share with someone. And if I want to support that right now, what I do is that I have to republish the tagged picture somewhere else, because I don't have a good way to share only part of a hierarchy or something across a hierarchy that matches these tags. And maybe it's complicated, but I think it's a useful use case. That's at least something that I really do a lot. So this is all these kind of things that we can think about. Also, yeah, I've seen interesting stuff in some file system where they have tags, and actually you can navigate in tags through some kind of links. You can get into a link directory that has all the resources tagged with a given tag, and it's magically presented like that. But that's an end user presentation more than anything else. Yeah, a bit also like Gmail does with tags in mails. When you access, well, is that still possible to access Gmail through IMAP? Well, that used to be, tags used to be mapped to IMAP folders, basically, in Gmail.
Yeah.
I see people raising hands. I think Philippe was first.
Yeah, so much to unpack. Well,
sorry.
It's good. I like it. Well, first of all, thank you so much for engaging. And also, so you were saying teach WNFS more than files being just UnixFS files. Maybe I should update the spec a little bit. Right now, the API in RSWNFS, for example, is you don't actually pass RSWNFS a UnixFS file or a bunch of bytes or do reads and writes into files. What you do right now is, because for us it was like making this simpler for the first implementation, but you pass it SIDs of files. And so technically you can put any kind of interplanetary linked data as a file into WNFS. Mm-hmm. It's just that some clients won't be able to know what to do with it.
Right.
So for example, if you
that's the other thing that I'm not sure about. It's like I would have this Capillion persisted data to how much do I care that just a regular WNFS browser can make something useful out of it?
So for there,
I don't have an answer to that. It's but,
for there's like another option. So we have extensible metadata in WNFS, and from this metadata you can even link SIDs, so to some other kind of data. So you might have some file that is just an image, perfectly fine to be read on like from IPFS gateways or whatever. And then in the metadata of this file, you would have a link to a thumbnail of this file or something else. And those can be SIDs to further UnixFS files. And IPFS pinners know what to do with it and can pin it. So that would be another way of adding metadata in there. Right now, we don't have APIs for updating that nicely. And also there's a question of like, how do we keep that updated? So if you delete the file, also, of course, the file and the metadata gets deleted. But if you update the file, the thumbnail doesn't get invalidated. So I guess there, what I'd like to know is exactly what do those APIs for the visual file system that you're working on look like? How do you use this kind of document database that you're using? Maybe you have some link to it.
I can point you to the API that is used by the current system, and that should be informative.
And then you mentioned tags. So the public file system with WNFS is actually a DAG. So it's a directed acyclic graph. So you can have like a directory for a specific tag and link to all of the files that have this tag. Again, we don't currently have have our clients that is like the web native library or RS WNFS understand that. So like if you delete a file, that you automatically delete it from the tag directories in a way. So that doesn't exist yet. And also that would be possible in the public file system, but not really in the private file system. There it's hardest to do. And also the same thing goes with like giving someone read and write access to only a specific tag. That is something that we need to think about. Maybe that is currently still a challenge, at least I think. But yeah, thanks for raising that. That's as much as I can say about that.
It's the fact that you mentioned public versus private also. Yeah, it's something I didn't mention. I mean, since it's user sensitive data, I mean, it's super important for me to get device side encryption. And that's also why I didn't start to do anything by myself, because I knew that I would meet people in Iceland. I was like, I want to hear about what they're doing, how these systems can provide me something. And the encryption part is important. And yeah, I know the challenges about sharing versus encrypting and how that can be problematic or not.
I think it's a solvable problem. I think it's a solvable problem. We just have to think about it a little bit.
Yeah, just spend 3 years working on it, and it's totally solvable. But that's why we're doing this. So is exactly the thing is let's collab on the really, really hard parts, and where interop is a goal. Brooke, hand.
So Philip got to a few of these things, so sorry if a little bit of this overlaps. Tagging systems, that was actually one of the things that we came up with like first. It was like an initial design goal way back at the dawn of time. Tags and categories. So we had them separated out, where categories were more like, give me all of the music by default. And then the kernel of the system would just update an index of like, here's everything that we know is a song. Separately from like a user-controlled tag that this is like important or not. Right?
So categories are more like content types.
Yeah, like content types, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So borrowing a lot from like the Mac Finder, basically, as metaphor. As Philip mentioned, on the public side, this is relatively straightforward to do because you can just add pointers to things and like you're done, right? On the private side, this leaks tons of information, and so we pushed that off because it's not even that you have to rebuild this index or even getting high up enough in the tree to build new items. Like there are ways of handling that. Like we could do that, but then even having read access into that is like, well, here's all of the music, or here's all of the everything that's marked as important, right? If you have read access to that. So it's really hard to do like granular access control. Again, I don't think it's impossible. It's just we haven't spent the time digging into it because we had, other things that needed to come first. But it actually ends up being more complex than we thought initially. And so, I mean, totally happy to bump that up for priority if that's a major thing. On putting arbitrary IPLD in WNFS. So initially we had this idea of like a V0 WNFS would be just raw IPLD. V1 is our first version of the file system, and then V2 is like this updated version. What we ran into relatively quickly when we were doing the collaboration with Query late last year is if you want to have concurrent writes, which I'm not sure Capulum needs, but if you want to do concurrent writes, which Query at the time definitely needed, these files or linked data now needs to have some sort of a merge semantic. And so you either say, well, we're just going to replace everything from the top node and say, one of these two is going to win, and then we'll have the history, and then you can replace them. But people seem to want to have some kind of a way of breaking that data up and then having some sort of a merge on it. So they were doing data sets, right? So they wanted to be able to merge data sets and row level edits and things. So that idea you may see kicking around in the docs in places called a linked data file or a LD file. So anyway, just a little bit of color on that one.
Okay.
And in terms of interfaces, we'll go to Brian first and probably continue this, but I think that is going to lead us pretty directly into the ADL stuff. So Brian?
Yeah, I was wondering if the tags thing could be done at the metadata level. Assuming extensible metadata were available, could you set it so that a user could like set tags for a given file, and then a directory could contain sort of a manifest of all the tags that are within, that are on files within that directory, and sort of create an overlay, on top of things. Not sure what that would mean in terms of privacy for metadata though as well.
Yeah, so that was the original design, or close to the original design. So the problem with having it in both places, which you can do, right? But if those get out of sync, now you don't have a single source of truth. Is it tagged or not?
Yeah.
So I'm thinking back, I think where we landed on that was putting it on the metadata was the source of truth, and then we were going to treat the index like just a cache, so you could blow it away and rebuild it, right? If it came out of sync. But it has all of these same, as soon as you have that manifest at the top, it has all the same privacy challenges. Again, not insurmountable, but like, yeah, what you described was the design, basically. Yeah.
I think what would work with today's spec, like we could implement that in RS WNFS without violating our spec right now, is we could have like a directory that represents a tag, and that just links to all of the files on the private file system that have this tag. And it would even be possible to like share a single key for reading all of the tags. You just need to have like a client that is aware of this tagging mechanism, so that it correctly on writes correctly recomputes the index, the tag index essentially. But yeah, this works for read access, I'm pretty sure.
It works for read access if you have root. So again, this was the original design, right? That works for read access if you have read access to the entire file system. Because otherwise you're showing, here's all of the files that are important or something, right? And so you can like obfuscate them, but it's still like, well, there's 50 of them. And, like you have to be able to give people some, like you're either giving them access to the entire index or none of it. You may start leaking into other parts of the file system that they shouldn't have access, right? Like it's not as simple as we can have a directory that.
No. I mean, we would have a private directory that would link to private files.
Yeah.
Okay.
Who has access to the private directory?
What kind of access? Write access?
Read access. Who has read access to that directory?
Anyone you shared the key with.
Right. So you either have an all or nothing index.
Yes. Yes, you're
So
giving like access to a specific tag at the same time, and you can't like if you want to like give access to just some subdirectory, you can still do that. But like the tag will give you access to all of the things that are tagged like with something.
correct. So it's a really easy way to accidentally elevate somebody's rights, like without a W, RIGHTS, right, in a system. Because then as soon as somebody tags something with that, they have access to this entire other subtag. This entire other
Oh
subtag.
yeah, okay, yeah. Then the thing is, who has write access to the tagging directory? So there's like just a subset of people who actually are able to tag stuff. Yeah, I don't know. We can take this offline too.
So I think it's possible to do. It's just it needs a lot more thinking, right? So, Boris.
Bunch of things. So first of all, Moth, you had a hand and you took the hand down. Do you want to jump back in line?
No, I'm good, thanks.
Okay. So couple things I want to highlight is Fabrice, I think one of the things that you'll notice is we are very spec focused, and we're also very privacy focused on some of these things, and being like, this is really hard, but like it needs to get done correctly. What we do need is use cases. And I think the other thing that we need, and Brian kind of brought this up in part as well, is we actually need to start sketching out and playing with and looking at user interactions and flows of understanding what that actually feels like. So Ryan on our team has done some, who's product design and UX focused, has sketched out some of our UCAN based login stuff. This is the same kind of thing that we may actually try sketching out some sharing flows, or even try some stuff like public only first, so that we're not blocked by some of the how you do the private stuff in different ways. And even there, that ends up being interesting of what we can do with it. So I also wanted to say, Fabrice, like everything that you're saying about, is the file system the right metaphor? How is this actually going to look for users? Let's not be so dumb about it. Like we've had all the same thoughts of those things. And this is also where some of the Brooke mentioned about categories versus tags. And we've had these slight things where we're like, are we accidentally building an operating system? And of course you are. So I think it's super fantastic to have a running system where we can work with some of these semantics. And I love that it's mobile first, which AKA is the vast majority of people doing it. I will say that our hypothesis has been is that for developers, something that feels like a file system makes logical sense, but totally agree that leaking that and exposing that all the way, oh damn, I don't know what gesture does my face lock. I'm sorry.
Dramatic chipmunk mode.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think the takeaway is we would love to actually work with you on maybe prototyping some of these flows in Capiloon. And then the other side of this is working with the web native SDK and some web-based apps of saying, here's what it looks like in a mobile context with Capiloon. Here's what it looks like to browse, look at some of these interfaces in a web app, and even things like what is the default widget that we might design that developers can use to look at some of these semantically different things.
Move.
Yep.
Yeah, if I may, this kind of relates to the IPLD URL spec that I'm working on and some of the gateway stuff where IMO, a really nice interface for developers to work with this data, is URLs, which are almost like a file system, but a little bit extra and a little bit less, where it might be useful to think about like an WNFS protocol handler or what a WNFS like gateway would look like, and maybe even write specs for it or look at what exists in the IPFS pathing gateway spec and like see if that could be extended. Because personally, from working with peer-to-peer web apps, one of the things I've been trying to do is just to like simplify the amount of code and learning you need to do to actually use this stuff. And so with that end, one of the concepts I brought in for the various protocols I support is the ability to put a file into an IPNS URL, and then that just like adds the file to your data set. And it's really nice to think about in that, you know, it's fast. You don't need extra code. You just kind of like write data, read it back, and then I could see the same things happening for like doing privacy stuff, like passing in a authorization header or whatever else. So that might be a cool thing to explore for y'all.
Yeah, I'd love to explore some of that stuff more. Would you be, or do you have time to write up a little bit about that use case in a discussion on the org? Thank you. Awesome.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And while we're talking about ADL stuff, so first off, because I feel like I'm finally going to the source on this, can you give me a definition of how an ADL is different from a codec, is different from a schema? Because I've read the page, I've talked to a few people, and I get like slightly different answers. And the closest I've gotten to is like an ADL is basically like a lens, but not. And then I think we can open up the entire discussion on file system API and how that relates to ADLs. Please.
Yeah, totally. I could give a rundown because I'm kind of new to the ADL stuff too. I mean, like, I guess it's been a few months now since I started looking into it, but I actually preempted you talking about that, and I just posted a comment in the discussion thread with some links. So IMO and ADL is really three things. And the first and most important one is a spec for what the data looks like. So we have the raw IPLD data model. And in order to have a useful ADL, you need to say like, what is the data that I'm doing an advanced view over? So for hash array maps tries, or whatever this smart acronym was, I don't remember. It's like we have these nodes and this is how we construct the IPLD tree. This is what it means. And then here's how you map that to like a regular map interface. And so the first part is just the description of the data and how it maps between this like fancy format and a more simplified, like user-friendly format. Then the next bit is a node reifier function, which takes the root node of your complex IPLD tree, and then it returns kind of like a fake IPLD node, which wraps over the root node and gives you a higher level interface. So in the case of the hash array mapped try, it gives you just like a regular map rather than the entire tree of nodes. And then you can get keys as though it were a regular map. Whereas under the hood, there's some code that will go and like fetch the individual nodes and kind of do the traversal. I mean, like if it's a private file system. And then the next bit is how do I get the raw node back out of my ADL node? And that's the substrate property, which can get added on. So that's kind of the gist of ADLs. Like, I think the most important part is the spec for the data, which may or may not use schemas. I think schemas just make it a little easier. And then the next is just like this reifier. So it's very loose in what you can do with it. So you can literally map any IPLD tree to any IPLD tree, which is a little spooky. In fact, if I can ramble a bit more, I was thinking we could do really crazy things. Like what if we had a SQL schema and we had an ADL that maps SQL queries to a node list of results, which is insane, but that's something you can do with ADLs. Similarly, this relates to the WebAssembly work that Adine has been working on, where we can have WebAssembly that will dynamically generate these IPLD nodes as they're invoked. The difference between codecs and ADLs is that codecs will take some raw binary and return an IPLD node. And usually codecs aren't doing any extra network IO. Whereas in ADL, it'll take a node and return a node, and it might be doing extra network IO. So, and schemas, I think, are pretty much just like you take a node and you return a node, but you like ignore some of the fields, or you do a bit of extra validation. That's my understanding. Hopefully it's not too divergent from what others think.
Philip?
I was wondering whether ADLs had this requirement that, like, you're mapping, for example, you're mapping a UnixFS directory into an IPLD map, but are you required to be able to take like a huge map, one that is way too big, of course, and then uniquely, or you can take that and map it back into a HAMT, and that kind of mapping is, and like the ADL requires that kind of mapping is, I forget like the word, but basically deterministic. So like, or it's an isomorphism in a way where you can go one way and the other and go back and you'll arrive at the same thing. Am I thinking right with this?
So what I've seen in ADLs is they're usually one way. It's you have the more complex thing and you map it to a simple thing. And the way that works is you write some custom code for it. So one glaring issue, which I think you kind of allude to is how do we create that complex thing, where right now ADLs don't prescribe anything for that. They're just like, you assemble the complex tree however, and the ADL will simplify it for pathing. The other side is still to be determined. There's actually in the IPLD call, we started talking about like what is a writable ADL, which is kind of, we don't know yet, but yeah, so it's one way.
Sorry, Philip. Okay. Have you looked at Cambria from InkinSwitch by any chance?
Yeah, it's really cool. It's very intense, like all the lensing.
Yeah, so I wonder if, and I actually don't know who the right person to talk to about this stuff is, but in order to have it be writable, you'll need to be able to go both ways, right? And so I wonder if something like Cambria and a description like that, because it sounds, at least in one direction, it sounds very similar, right? Of like, I'm going to go from my data type to some other, I'm going to do this mapping, and that map is only on, actually, let me repeat some of this back and stop me at any point where I'm wrong. That mapping is only against a virtual version of this, of the data that I'm trying to go into, right? And so I can do pathing, I can do all these things, regardless of the actual physical layout of the data. But then I have no way of getting back, right? And so I could say it's effectful. So I might still make network requests, I might do all these other things. I might fill in fields that are missing to map into this new thing. So if I go, say, from UnixFS into WNFS, I can add the blank metadata headers and all of that in there. For example, I assume like I could go in either direction. I could write an ADL for either direction. How is it, other than the fact that it only goes one way and it doesn't have this bidirectional property or requirement, what does it let you do in addition, right? Like I can make network requests. Can I write to disk? Can I put stuff in secondary data structures? Like how broad is an ADL?
Yeah, so just one thing to clarify, updating the underlying data with an ADL isn't something that's prevented. It's just not something that people actively do. But if you look at the links in the discussions, I can repost the relevant one in the chat. For the node reifier function is it takes a link context, a node, and a link system. I think the link system is how it can load more data and I guess add more data. And then I don't remember what the link context did. Let me see real quick. I think is also related to pathing. But so it can load and upload nodes. So it can do pretty much whatever in there. One thing you mentioned that is sparking some more stuff is we're actively thinking about like what would mutating an ADL look like, or what would some higher level interfaces be for like maps, lists, and all those other nodes. And so hypothetically, you could have an ADL where you wrap over the complex data set, and then if you tell it to add a key, it will modify the underlying data and return like a new modified tree with a new substrate node you can fetch. So we could do modification that way. It's just I think most people don't bother at the moment. I don't know if that answered your comments.
Yeah, totally. So is the main, because pathing's come up a bunch, and back in Reykjavik, that was in the one session about doing ADLs and gateways. I kept coming back to that. I was like, so is this just for pathing? Because like that's kind of, at least in the gateway case, that's what it sounded like, as opposed to like a full file system interface with like move and copy, and like some of them you can't copy and some of them you can, and some of them will have metadata headers and others won't. And like there's a lot of complexity in what is a file system. Is it really mainly for pathing or for anything, I guess?
Yeah, so it's ADLs are purely for the IPLD data model, and that means pathing, but it could also mean like pathing, but then doing some sort of operation on a node and then working back up to the root. However, it doesn't prescribe anything for file systems in general. And I think that's also where I think on Discord or Matrix or whatever, Adine mentioned that it'd be useful to talk about like what is a file system, as maybe there is a structure that we have on top of IPLD that is the structure of file systems in general. And we could like spec out like how do we relate IPLD pathing to that, and how do we relate getting and fetching data from that into IPLD. So that's one thing I'm kind of curious about, because like I think as you alluded to, the raw IPLD data model is not really geared for file systems. Like it's missing a lot of that extra stuff. But I think that's an opportunity for us to have a spec for what a file system is in this ecosystem, and then just be like, we're going to conform UnixFS to it. We're going to conform WNFS or PureGhost or whatever.
And where you mean conform, that's like writing an ADL that would get it into that format, or down at the nuts and bolts layer?
Well, I mean, it could be an ADL if that's necessary, but one way we could go about it is like, if we have a directory structure, we could say that each node that's linked to isn't just raw data, but it's like a node with these particular properties. And so that could either be like represented in raw IPLD, or you could have the roots be interpreted via an ADL to return that like more useful directory structure. So like, for instance, what Adine did with BitTorrent. So in BitTorrent, we have that like info header, which represents the file system in BitTorrent, but it's BitTorrent specific. It's not UnixFS specific. It's not WNFS, and there's no clear way of like mapping between the two. So what we could do is we can say, hey, if you want to be an IPLD file system, here's how you need to structure your nodes. And then you can take BitTorrent or whatever else and just kind of morph it into the shape that we expect using ADLs. So I'm guessing the really important bits there are like content length, maybe some sort of permissions. I don't know what else, M-time. So yeah. The ADL is there to show us the shape of the data that we say is a file system. Could be.
Yeah, just, you know, as a hot take, I think the ADL approach is going to be by far the most flexible for most projects, right? Just because there's so many different requirements for like even, you know, we're doing directory sharding, things like that, right? It's like, yeah, we could put specially named links down, and now, you know, this spec for file system now has to know about sharding and has to know about all these other things, right? So it gets it starts to entangle with the way that we're laying out data, and doing some sort of mapping just separates those layers and makes it much easier, I think, to do an implementation versus do a view of that implementation. But that's just, you know, gut feel at this point. I'll give this a bunch of, you know, a read.
I think what's probably useful to say is, and even just in Fabrice's talking about virtual file systems and saying, do we really want to expose this, is that the ADL approach means any sort of linked data, and it's unclear if lowest common denominator, what is a file system mixing down, is any more helpful. I think there's some interesting things in there. You know, I've definitely thought about, like, you know, making WNFS browsable in gateways. You know, we maintain the pretty path to make it appear like a Unix FS file system for that to just work with today's gateways. And all of these things are like slightly connected together because it was easier to make that pretty path to then adopt all of the existing Unix FS tooling than having to write the own display layer. But also at the same time, and literally we run the relatively plain Jane version of this in the gateway that we host right now. I'm like, there's a bunch of random stuff in this header that's like, I don't want an install link and I don't want all this other stuff here, which of course leads me down the route of, like, we solved this once before with like Apache and like directory browsing and styling it. And so I don't know what the right answer there is, but like definitely the ability for people to theme and view things in different ways. And this whole, like, what is a gateway, right?
Yeah, I think one of the things too is having a spec for file systems doesn't mean that everything can only use that spec, because obviously that is the lowest common denominator, which will get rid of like potential features, like is tagging something that will be in that spec, which my gut feeling is probably not, because not everyone is going to conform to it. But that also means that WNFS is useful as its own thing, even outside of this file system spec. Like the file system spec would be more like for reading and just like giving nice UX to people that need it, that aren't using the specific implementation, and for interoperability between them. Like, what if we link to Unix FS from WNFS? So that's something we could do with a symlink. That's like this sort of use cases where I think it'll be more useful, but totally like it on its own is going to be more powerful and have features that are probably not going to exist in others, which is probably also a good thing.
Yeah, like I think we see this with like on disk file systems or traditional file systems already, right? It's, you know, if I have you know, ZFS or ButterFS or, you know, APFS, they all have the same, you know, POSIX interface, and some of them have extra features, right? And so I like, despite the fact that I'm like pushing on sort of like the edges of this and trying to figure out like where things are, it would be totally useful to be able to go to a gateway and just load data, right, at a path. And so for tools, I think this stuff makes a lot of sense. You know, to Boris's point, yeah, like, you know, an end user is probably not going to say like, yeah, I would like to represent this file system, but as a whatever the type is instead, right? But like their tooling will do it for them. The example that Adina and I were talking about in Reykjavik that was interesting was like, well, what if I wanted to pull down a video and load it into VLC, right, via URL? Well, I could run, and like this is a bit of a Rube Goldberg machine to do this, right? But like I could run Kubo and expose that as a gateway, and then have some sort of a mapping there so that Kubo knows how to pull the file down and expose that on, you know, on a certain path, and then you know, you can wire that into VLC. It's like, okay, interesting. Now I have interplanetary linked videos. Great, amazing. And that doesn't prevent you from having additional interfaces, right? So this is something, and I mean, ADLs are like way ahead of the whole autocodec idea, but this is something I've thought about a little bit with autocodec is like, what are the interfaces that it would need to expose, essentially ADLs, right? To do this mapping into some well understood type, but it can also then have extra methods, for lack of a better term, right? On top of it. And so maybe it has, many different interfaces that it implements. And that seems genuinely useful, right? So Boris mentioned this pretty tree idea. And just for the recording and for anybody who hasn't seen this. And this is, I think, a core problem for a lot of these things. So even if you have ADLs on a gateway, you need to preload the ADLs that it can respond to, right? Because it doesn't know about them otherwise. So we wanted WNFS to be generally available everywhere. Pinata, our own service, IPFS.io, all these other things. And so what we did is essentially a reduction. So we removed all the stuff that wasn't in UnixFS and placed that as a cache at a particular path on the tree. And every time we did a write, we updated that. It didn't have any of the history. It didn't work on private data, none of this stuff, right? It was just sort of like, if I want to give people a really clean link, this is the way to do it. And then they can also pull data off of the gateway like this, right? Move.
Yeah, I think that relates a lot to the WebAssembly stuff where, as you said, supporting all of the ADLs is kind of difficult, where once we can get WebAssembly to a place where it's actually usable, we could just say, hey, here is a tree of data. Here's the ADL you want to load through WebAssembly, and then it can do whatever magic we want. Also, Boris, you mentioned pretty directory listing. What's really, I think, kind of bonkers, in my opinion, is that you can use an ADL WebAssembly module for that. In that, as I mentioned before, you can take any IPLD node and return any IPLD node. That includes a buffer of bytes. So we could have that Apache use case, but it's fully on the edge using WebAssembly.
Remember, the actual flex here is that we're trying to recreate two things. One is Mac OS 8 themes, and two, the other classic is Winamp skins. We will drag the early 90s and early 2000s back.
That'd be cool. Like, we could all just bring our own WebAssembly modules for
Yes.
interpreting file systems.
Yeah. It's there's another tool chain there where Ryan would say he has this like builders, linters, viewers thing of all the things that you would want. Is you would want a builder for designers who could very easily do some things and then compose it to turn it into a WebAssembly. And we have an explosion of Mac OS 8 themes of browsing IPFS 8 data that would, of course, be compatible with a system-wide theming system in Capiloon, right, Fabrice?
Of course, yeah. I mean, yeah, I'm always a bit worried when I hear people saying, "Oh, we're gonna put some Turing complete code." And I'm like, yeah, what could go wrong? But I mean,
remember, everybody has to promise. I promise not to help knowingly awaken the AI that will turn into Skynet. We are at an hour. I think we got through a bunch of useful stuff. Mauve, I think that stuff on ADLs was really, really useful to go through and get down. I think on the very practical side of things. So Fabrice, I haven't forgotten about Capiloon the mascot.
okay.
So I'll reach out to you for that. I think the other actionable thing that I'd love to figure out is certainly between Capiloon and some of the web native stuff is I think a very concrete thing would in fact be a file picker, file browser widget in Web Native SDK. And so, maybe that's hooked up to RSUCAN when that's ready. But that's one of the things I've had in mind for a while, and really next to that, doing end-to-end user flows. So Fabrice, maybe we'll get on a call with you and with Ryan and talk a little bit about that and see if we can, in fact, like get someone else who's not us to take a run at it, because then we have someone else who understands the WNFS code base and understands what the constraints are and have another set of eyes on that UX flows thing. And I think that would be really helpful because ultimately we have to understand how both public files are shared and private files are shared, which will necessarily mean going all the way to those flows. I think Fabrice as well, I think you should definitely like be unblocked, but the other follow-up is saying, having some of the team look at that and see what we need to do to support your number 4 use case. And again, we're happy to help support that.
Okay, yeah, I will check I don't know what the status is for the current Rust code base, the current Rust implementation, but that's what I would use because everything on my side is in Rust. So
perfect.
If there's something I can start to experiment with, I'll do that.
I have a couple of ideas that I'll talk to you offline as well to maybe add some more people as well. I think there's probably on the use cases side. So the N0 team wasn't here, but they very much want to focus on mobile kind of as an SDK. So my best example of this, and it's not perfect, is kind of iCloud-like in the fact that you're kind of like syncing to a native mobile, right? So Apple, as an example, has a bunch of SDK stuff that's built in, but of course that's all built in directly to their systems. But I haven't caught up with Brendan on how he's thinking about use cases. Brooke, do you know any more there, or is that, I think that's probably just a follow-up with Brendan?
Yeah, follow-up. I think that's all like out of scope for them currently. So they're just getting the system working. So
yeah, but they're also doing I think their native mobile, IPFS on native mobile is tomorrow, is their first kickoff meeting.
Yes.
Okay.
Maybe it makes sense. Should I do a small update on maybe?
Oh, right, specs, please.
Also,
yes, Philip.
Yeah, that is specs, and also maybe about the comment from Fabrice about like where is RSWNFS right now.
Okay.
So maybe that first. So RSWNFS, there is a Rust crate. You can install it. You can do stuff with the public file system. The data layout is probably going to change soon, so it's kind of in an alpha state. The private file system is still like in APR, hasn't merged yet, and we're still actively working on it. Yeah, that's so much to the state of it. But yeah, I don't know whether I want to give binding time estimates here, but I'm thinking this is we're getting to this pretty soon, getting into a state where in a somewhat not that documented way, you can use RSWNFS to do fun stuff, private directories, encrypt stuff, these kind of things.
Okay, cool.
Regarding the spec stuff, so recently I've been working on fixing some things around the metadata and actually how we spec it. And I wrote up a bunch of algorithms in APR so that it's more easily understandable from outsiders and maybe in a way like kind of auditable, or like you can take a look at it and understand what the mechanics are behind the private file system. So that's something I've been doing recently. We've been thinking about public directory sharding a little bit, since technically the data structure we're using there is probably going to be pretty powerful, allowing range queries and stuff like that. We're kind of excited about that. Also, we're thinking about an improvement for the private file system regarding privacy and better composability with salted name filters. But yeah, there's an issue in the spec repo. So that's where the things are in flux right now. That's the state of it, I guess, in a way.
Anything else we need to cover live? Awesome. We will post in the discussion thread. I think a lot of this is the first one of these, so thank you for coming. I think a lot of these things, please do feel free to start discussion threads on literally anything that you might have a longer discussion around. That's proved helpful elsewhere as well. And if we can, share use cases or things that we're struggling with or other stuff like that, we can do targeted stuff on that. I'll pull out some action items around UX flows, and I think Mauve committed to just writing some stuff in the discussion threads as well. I think all of this stuff is gonna ramp up. I know both Web Recorder was one of the things that Ilya was looking at was the range query stuff. Philip, so we may want to talk to him directly to make sure that we can support the Web Recorder use cases. I think that's always sort of super helpful for us in knowing that someone's used that. Mo? Very
interesting. Okay.
I'm actually working for Web Recorder too.
All the hats.
Honestly.
So Philip, if you can start a thread on range queries, and then we could just go like, will this work for you? This is how we're looking at it. This is what, and then, I know some of that will in fact have to go into what are the semantics of passing it to the gateway that supports range queries, right? And you tell me, I'm like, is that at the HTTP layer or?
I mean, look, a lot of this stuff, Brent and I talked about this relatively extensively, even the question of like, what is IPFS, right? It's really simple. It's IPLD and ways to move it around, and everything else is at the application layer. And so you may or may not have a gateway that knows how to do smarter things, range queries, et cetera, or some other application that can do these things, right? Like that feels like a really nice, clean definition to me. And then we don't have to worry about like being everything to everyone all the time.
Yep, exactly. Okay, fantastic. Thank you, everyone. We have a calendar item already that you kind of once you're in, you're subscribed to all the future ones, depending on what you did. But we'll announce in all the channels and update timing and agenda as things go, and we can always jump on calls or do stuff sync or async as needed. Lovely to see you all.